Bienvenidos a un nuevo episodio. En el episodio de hoy discutiremos las consecuencias y el impacto que trae la guerra en las sociedades, cómo la guerra afecta la integridad de las instituciones, el desarrollo de la cultura, el crecimiento de la economía y más. La experta que nos acompaña hoy es Brick Murtzashvili. Ella es profesora y directora y fundadora del Center for Governance and Markets en la Universidad de Pittsburgh. Además, es una académica prolífica y escritora. Es autora de 3 libros, incluyendo Land, the State and War, Property Institutions and Political Order in Afghanistan. Esperamos que lo disfrutes.
Thank you very much for agreeing to this podcast. We are very excited to talk to you about war and development.
It's a pleasure.
So before we delve into the subject matter, can you tell us what the Center for Governance and Market is and what does it do?
So our center is a very new research center at the University of Pittsburgh, and we are very Ostromian. We are very focused on understanding the informal de facto rules of society, and our center works across many different subject areas, from economic institutions and property rights to security issues to even the governance of emerging technologies. And what unites all of the faculty in our center is this real commitment to understanding bottom-up processes. Because if, when people make public policy, if they don't understand the rules, the informal rules of the game, they're going to make a lot of mistakes. So what we try to do is to bring to the world this understanding of bottom-up processes and how they're important for public policy.
So you must have an interdisciplinary crew.
Very interdisciplinary. We have about 20 faculty across. We have English language professors, literature professors. We have computer scientists who are looking at Bitcoin and blockchain and spectrum governance. We have law professors, people in the education school, of course, political science and economics. So very interdisciplinary. And lots of partners around the world.
Yes.
As well.
Do you work around the world or just in certain areas?
We work all over.
Okay.
And we're growing, we're new, so we're very excited to work with UFM and colleagues here in Guatemala as well.
That's great. That's really great. I think most people would agree that war and violence breed poverty and that it retards economic growth. And in your fieldwork, have you found this to be the case?
Yes, of course. War has a huge impact on economic growth, and there's so many reasons for this. A lot of reason has to do with the displacement. A lot of it has to do with the way international aid and assistance comes to communities. A lot of it has to do with the repression of community norms, because during war, people sort of go into hiding. Like a lot of the networks that make communities work so well and that promote flourishing, they dissimulate, they disintegrate, and it's really hard for people to work with one another. So I think that's one of the big reasons that we look at from the bottom up about why countries face such difficult challenges during war.
What happens to private property during war?
So it's a really good question. And I think in every country, it's going to look a little different. I've spent so much time working on Afghanistan where there was no real private property rights. All land was owned by the government. And so in these cases where you have very strong formal rules, despite the fact that the state is so weak to enforce them, this breeds a lot of informality. So this is where you begin to see a lot of informal rules and informal organizations compete for ownership of private property. And that could lead to a lot of conflict, right? Because the rules of the game are not clear, and it's not clear who's in charge, and that leads to a lot of violence. So whoever's the strongest can take the most.
Okay, and I think we've noticed that in places like where you were talking about, where people go underground or they have to leave their property, that sort of wreaks havoc also, where in other countries where there have been some private property rights established.
Yeah, in fact, many cases I found, like during my field work in Afghanistan, that during the height of conflict, people left, right? And they were gone for 10 years, 15 years, and then other people would take their property.
Right.
So what happens when there's peace and people come back and find people on their land? And then when there's no clear ownership rights, whose land is this? And then 10 people can say, I have a property deed, because you have so many different governments, so many different authorities. It becomes very hard to resolve these conflicts.
I can just imagine. And what happens to governments also? I think that's an important question, because governments, do they grow in size and functions? Do they become more overreaching, or do they become less able to actually administer the country?
So this is a really important issue that I think most people have a hard time understanding. During wartime, I think many governments sort of collapse, or they don't function very well. That's sort of the definition of war, right? A real civil war where there's no legitimate use of violence. But then you have the post-conflict period where donors come in, the international community comes in, and I think one of the challenges we see in those environments with government is international assistance, very well-intentioned, wants to rebuild. But what happens is that when they rebuild governments, they create like a fantasy land. They create these beautiful organizational charts of government doing everything, providing housing, providing every single kind of public service you can imagine. But these governments are poor. They can't afford this vast scope. So rather than focusing on a few things to gain the confidence of people, the international community promotes a vast scope of government. We see this with like the Sustainable Development Goals.
Right, yes.
Yeah, they're huge. Governments should do all of these things. But if your government's very poor, and then they're tasked to do all of these things at once, this actually leads to a lot of corruption. It leads to a lot of dashed expectations. The government actually can't meet these things. And so what I've always suggested is that focus on 3 key goals: healthcare, education, security, for example. The 3 things that matter most. But instead we see, the international community focus on so many things. And of course, the local government follows what the donors say, because that's where the money is. And so this, to me, leads to a very unsustainable project. And I actually think it triggers conflict later.
So it's sort of like a vicious circle again, instead of allowing the country to rebuild on its own resources and based on their own sort of informal rules. It's sort of a top-down.
Very top-down. Very top-down.
Top-down approach.
Absolutely.
That is not realistic.
No, and it leads to these vicious circles. Exactly.
What does war do to culture, to religious practice, and to societal trust?
So it really damages social trust, right? We know that violence can damage social trust in most cases, but in some cases we do find, some cases, that it's actually can be strengthened trust between groups can sometimes be strengthened within groups. Between groups of different ethnicities, for example, sometimes it can be very hurt. Trust between people and the government, often it is hurt. But within communities, actually, we find that war often strengthens social trust because people have to rely on each other to get things done. But trust within groups of different religions often are harmed by this during conflict. So I think that's actually another thing that people often don't understand well, is that people expect that during war everything is wiped out. There's nothing left. But we actually find that people actually can build these relationships during war, and trust within groups can actually grow.
And help each other out also. I think during war, most of the useful assistance that people receive is probably from these cultural
Absolutely.
basis. That
if we look at what's happening right now in Ukraine, there's amazing stories of communities, people helping communities. I'm in touch with lots of friends right now in Ukraine, and they're telling me how they have groups on WhatsApp or groups on Viber or Signal, different social, where if someone needs medicine, someone goes to the store and tries to find, trying to help elderly. That even one person was describing how they live in one of these tall apartment buildings, and they collected all of the phone numbers of everybody in that staircase.
Okay.
And so everybody knows who's doing what. And during that time, but before the conflict, they didn't have such a social media group where they could text each other, I'm going to get bread. Do you need some? I'm doing this. Who needs help? Trying to help the elderly and things like that. So you can see in this case in Ukraine, we're seeing really strong social solidarity. Now, it's not always the case that this happens. Sometimes when you do have conflict, it can actually tear communities apart. It really depends on the nature of the conflict. So in the case of Ukraine, for example, it was a foreign invasion,
yes.
which brings people close together. But sometimes during civil conflict, we see the opposite happen.
People are more suspicious of each other.
Yes, especially from outside groups.
Your book deals with complex realities of Afghanistan. I think very few people have studied Afghanistan in the way you have. And it's a country that really has suffered decades of war, in which both the Soviet Union and the United States played an important part. Can you tell our audience sort of what the effects of this war has had on Afghan citizens and what happens next?
Yeah, I mean, it's really difficult, right? I mean, the amount of loss, the amount of violence, everyone has suffered from this. And, people have different coping strategies, but it really, I think, decimated people's trust in authorities, government. And this was one of the big mistakes, I think, that we saw when people look at, the international effort of the past 20 years failed. Well, I think one of the reasons it failed is because the international community and even many of the government officials didn't understand how distrustful people were of the state. Because the state was the source of so many bad practices. The state was stealing people's land. The state was the source of violence, whether that was the Taliban government, whether it was the communist government. So there was a very famous American general who went to Afghanistan, and he said, we are going to help, and we're going to bring government in a box. And we're going to go to rural areas, and we're going to bring government in a box and show people, how government can work. And I think he was thinking as an American of, trash collection and service provision. And to Afghans, the idea of government in a box was like tax collectors and police taking bribes and really bad behaviors, that people have such mistrust of authority that the last thing they wanted was the government. And it's not because people don't like the government or don't want. People actually have a strong desire for a functioning state. But the functioning state that they know and they have seen is not one that they want. But they know that there's something better that can be achieved. But they know that, especially the past 20 years, the government was terribly corrupt. So when we were saying, government in a box, they're saying, this is just going to be bribes. It's going to be people abusing us. And so before extending government, we need to think carefully about how people understand what that is and how long it takes to transform that into something that serves citizens.
It should be bottom up, right?
Absolutely.
The rebuilding and not sort of imposed, bringing government in a box is sort of,
absolutely.
It even sounds artificial.
Of course.
Just bring it. Yeah.
Yes.
In your book, you say that Afghan forms of local government are surprisingly democratic. And in contrast to the reputation of the Taliban that has this reputation for authoritarian rule. So how do you reconcile these two levels of government?
It's never been reconciled in Afghanistan. And I think that's the reason why we have this ongoing conflict, is that no government has ever recognized the power of communities and their ability to self-govern. And the Taliban are making the same mistake right now that every single government before has made, is they have a vision for what the country should look like, and they're imposing it from the top. This is what happened over the past 20 years. You had technocratic government in Kabul that wanted to impose its vision on society. The international donors wanted to impose their vision without actually asking people what they wanted. And over the past 20 years, there were no elections for local officials. People had no voice in what the state looked like. So there's, until this issue, and it sounds so simple, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it sounds obvious, but why it's never been in the interest of the international community to devolve authority, because the international community wants to consolidate power. They're thinking about leaving quickly. They want unity of command and to deal with one person in the government. It's too complicated to deal with so many people. And of course, if you're a new president coming to power, you want to defeat all your rivals. So it's very convenient for you also to have strong unity of government. So this is why we never see this happen. And of course, it's messy.
Right.
And sometimes it's not perfect. And sometimes it's easier to administer programs from the top and less efficient to do it from the bottom up, especially in the very beginning. But the trade-off is that you lose legitimacy. And so none of these governments in Afghanistan have ever had legitimacy. It's the problem.
I don't think I had actually even ever read that there was a local government that was functional in Afghanistan before I read some of what you have published. So that's, I think, something that everybody has overlooked.
Yes.
Even academics, I think. Can you describe the process that local communities follow when there's a private property dispute?
Yeah, so it's fascinating. Most communities have what they call a shura process or a jirga process. And so if there is a dispute, you also have religious leaders involved sometimes if it's an inheritance issue, because inheritance is something that's covered by Islamic law. So if it's about inheritance, then a local religious figure is involved. And I had many jokes, actually, from my field research, people making fun of these religious leaders because they were the most easily bribable. It surprised me because I thought, religion in Afghanistan is the sacred. And they know you can get any village mullah to say what you want. There's so many of them, and you can go from mullah to mullah, and you find the mullah who will most accept your family's decision. But there's a process by which a community comes together. There's a process for showing evidence about who owns what land. And unlike elections, which are democratic, the process by which land disputes are resolved are by consensus. So it's not just one day you show up in court, it's a conversation over many, many days and even weeks to figure out who owns what and why and what is the solution. And it's about talking to different parties, negotiating a settlement, very much like a mediation. When the local leaders are good, sometimes they're not, sometimes they're corrupt. And so even the traditional leaders can be corrupt. And then if they take money, you can have a solution, but it's not an enduring solution. So at the very local level, it's quite possible to solve those land disputes. And often we found in our research that this was possible. Where the communities are not so good at solving dispute, it's often when people come from the outside to take land. And often when people do that, they're doing that because the government's letting them.
Okay.
And then it's almost impossible to solve those disputes.
Then you have the two layers of government.
Exactly.
Sort of in conflict.
Exactly.
The local governance of Afghan villages is hard for Westerners to understand, I think, because of what you mentioned, the mullah, the religious leader, is sort of in charge of a mosque, but he also plays these roles outside of the religious, the strictly religious activities of the village. You've already described a little bit of what they do in terms of private property disputes, but how can Westerners understand this better? Right?
So, if you don't have a government that you can trust, and I think that's hard for many people, especially in the United States, to understand. Well, if we have a problem, we just go to the government. I think the key is that these rules are made by people. And even though religious leaders are involved, religious leaders are also constrained by the population. So the informal norms in society really constrain what the actors can do, and that these actors kind of come from the community. And so therefore they are seen as legitimate in the eyes of the community. And so but even in the United States, we have had scholars, for example, on the American West, on the frontier, write about how there's a very famous book by Robert Ellickson called Order Without Law. And he's writing on California about how farmers negotiate disputes over land and pasture and sheep and all of the things that happen on farmland. It's much more effective than going to the government. So even though it's far from us to understand, and the role of religious leaders is very different, everybody is a Muslim. So they abide by, it's a common set of norms and expectations that they know that Islamic law says that this is how inheritance should work. But there's also variation within. So then where you can find one mullah who says one thing and one mullah who says another, there's different interpretations of law, just like you would find in any other country. So while there's differences, there's also, I think, similarities about fairness, about expectations of legitimacy, about treating people well. So I think these things actually come from society.
So the expectation that the mullah will serve, bring good values to bear on the decision-making process.
And the mullah is not seen as like in Afghanistan, it's very interesting. They have a very egalitarian form of social organization. And not all societies have this, an egalitarian form of religious organization. So Islam, unlike the Catholic Church, is not hierarchical, right? There's no pope. It comes from the bottom up. So there's no, it's not that this leader is speaking on behalf of someone else from the top. This religious leader has to get legitimacy from the community.
He's a member of the community.
A member of the community, yeah.
Building up democratic government institutions was, I think, the goal of U.S. foreign policy towards Afghanistan during the time that the U.S. was involved there. And it proved to be very complicated. How, who, and when can state building occur? Who can do it? How can it be done? Was it realistic? What does it take?
This is the $1 million question. And, I think one of the assumptions is that the U.S. was there to build democratic government. But my experience is that the U.S. was very confused about why it was there. And it was very hard to understand what the mission was. Because sometimes it was fighting terrorism. At other times it was government in a box. At other times it was building democracy. And you would talk to different, I would speak to different military officers, try to understand how they understood the mission. And often they would ask me what I thought the mission was. So I think this was one big lesson, is there was a lot of confusion about why the United States was there. At first it was fighting terrorism. We remember 9/11. Yes. But then the mission changed over time. But I think that the problem with state building is really the top-down effort. It was very prescriptive. A state needs this, this, and this. And then people thought if we could just throw money at the problem, that we could solve it. And then the longer the U.S. was there, the harder the problems were to solve. And then the more money they kept throwing at it. If we only throw money, we'll find a problem, we'll find a solution. But it was amazing because that didn't work. But the more it didn't work, the more they kept throwing money at it, thinking it's a resource problem. But the money just made things worse. It wasn't a resource problem at all. There was too much money. Afghan society couldn't absorb it. It led to vast corruption. And that corruption really hurt people's trust in government. So in order for state building to work, I think we have to think very carefully about the scope of the state. limiting what the state does. And that may sound very counterintuitive and even cruel, right? Because you think about, we want to help people, and these poor societies have no health care, no education. Let's do everything for them. But by doing everything for them, we end up doing nothing. Mm-hmm. And by focusing on a few goals, shared goals that everyone shares, then I think in doing it really from the bottom up would allow the state to gain trust and gain confidence.
Can you recommend additional reading for our audience on Afghanistan or these issues?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a brilliant book by an anthropologist. His name is Thomas Barfield. It's called Afghanistan, Political and Cultural History. And it's a brilliant book because it's easy to read.
Okay.
and he writes in a very easy style, even with a sense of humor.
Okay.
So I'd really recommend Thomas Barfield's book on Afghanistan for people who are interested in general history. Mm-hmm. He has a very interesting model in his book. He talks about the American cheese model versus the Swiss cheese model. And you know, American cheese is like a square, and it's one shape, and it's consistent throughout. And he says what the United States tried to do was impose American cheese on Afghanistan and impose uniformity of government across this very diverse country, where a Swiss cheese model has some holes, each piece looks different, and you don't govern each place. Each place looks a little different. And I really like that way of thinking, of looking at how the communities look and then making governance decisions based on that. So I think it's a very clever book. So I'd really recommend Thomas Barfield's book on Afghanistan.
Thank you very much, Jen, for this interview.
Yeah,
we
it's a
really
pleasure.
appreciate it.
Thank you.
Gracias por acompañarnos en un nuevo episodio del podcast Fe y Libertad. Si quieres conocer más sobre lo que acabas de escuchar, ingresa a www.feylibertad.org y descubre nuestros podcasts y blogs. Nos vemos a la próxima.